Welcome once again to the literacy education course that ECU has prepared for Teach for America. We are in Module 4, Assessment, and I want to emphasize again and again, assessment in ways that benefit student learning. The goal, whenever you're administering an assessment, is that the results will in some way positively impact student learning. I want you to keep this goal in mind as I try and give you a warp speed overview of assessment in general, and then specifically what quality assessment looks like for literacy, and a few examples of types of assessments that you can use in a literacy context. Now, as with so many things, if you have questions, if you are confused about something, please reach out to us. Please let us know if anything's not working for you. We need to know that so that we can fix it, make it better, and move forward. Generally speaking, there are two basic types of assessment, formative and summative. So formative are going to be assessments that are ongoing. They typically occur when there is still time to adjust the instruction that you're doing on a topic. So these could be exit tickets, they could be pop quizzes, they could be running records. There's a lot of different ways that these could go, but the essential aspect of them is that they are meant to identify a breakdown in instruction so that you can adjust your instruction for the students you currently have in your class. So it is something I didn't work. I can tell that because when I assessed the class, the majority of the class didn't understand. I go back and I teach the same topic again to these same students. That's formative. Then there's summative. Summative assessments are evaluation assessments. They occur when instruction is ended. And if you're wondering, well, then what's the purpose of an assessment? How am I positively impacting student learning the way that I said all good assessments should do? So you're not positively impacting the learning of your current students about that topic, but you should always take that information and then use it to better understand your students that you have the next time around, or better understand your instruction next time around. Those summative assessments might also help prepare the next teacher that has these students in teaching them, because often that information, those big summative assessments, especially like state level testing and that sort of thing, can be a tool when you get new students. So it sort of gets passed, information gets passed from one teacher to the next to help them plan instruction. So those are the two basic types, formative and summative. Summative testing, high stakes testing is going to come up during this conversation because there's no way to avoid it, so we might as well start here. Summative assessments and high stakes testing typically are the same thing. Students, teachers, parents, community members, the government, they're all what we call stakeholders in summative assessments. They're invested in knowing what students have learned by the end. These groups, at least some of them, are often less involved in the formative assessment stage. They're less involved when you're still in those cycles of instruction and haven't declared a topic or an instructional unit over, but you start getting more stakeholders for these summative assessments. High stakes testing, I try not to put a lot of importance on the outcome of high stakes testing for a lot of reasons that we're going to go into. So let's dig a little deeper. So we're going to go back to a little bit of the history that we looked at in the introductory module, just to better contextualize the place that high stakes testing has had in the United States and why we are where we are. And I suppose my hope in going back over some of these things is to give you the context that high stakes testing developed in, so that when you hit those inevitable frustrations with high stakes testing, basically these are the things I remind myself of, that all of the changes to our educational system are rooted in people trying to do better for students. And what we think will benefit students changes. And as you saw in our introductory module, it can be cyclical. But let's see where high stakes testing comes from. It's really, for better or worse, rooted in the civil rights movement. ESEA, which stands for Elementary and Secondary Education Act, was enacted in the late 50s, early 60s. And the point of it was to improve children's access to equitable educational opportunity. Basically, everyone recognized that certain groups of students had more access than others, and as a result, they were achieving differently than others, and they wanted to close the gap. So they have the act enacted. Well, as we know, just saying make something more equitable doesn't always lead where we want it to, And by the 1970s, there was a new outcry for minimum competency standards. It was, okay, we said be equitable, we're not really seeing the results we need, and maybe that's unrealistic. How about just a minimum? What's a minimum that everybody can hit? And that happened for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to get into it. I have, in fact, taken, again, I could teach a course on every single topic that we talk about, and even sometimes the little topics within the topics we talk about. I personally have taken multiple courses in the history of literacy, so I find this stuff really fascinating, and it helps me better understand where we're at. I'm trying to go at high speed through it. So I'll let the 70s lie. A lot of things happened in the 70s, but let's hit the 80s, because that's when there was a report published called A Nation at Risk. And there were a lot of reasons that happened. In the 80s, the U.S. economy was struggling. It was trying to enter a global market, and because learning is so social, social issues have effects on learning. Education was an easy place to lay the blame for the ways that we were struggling in the global economy, saying that our education was lacking in ways that international and global educations were not, and we needed to fix this. So standards were seen, those great standards in the 70s, they were seen as holding students back. It was holding their achievement back. They thought that having the standards didn't translate into instructional change, and realistically it probably didn't for most students. Again, big generalizations. There are always pockets of instruction that work differently. You or your parents might have had instruction in the 1970s that was amazing and aligns with exactly what we think is good about education today. Most people didn't get that. So that contributed to the reading wars in the 90s. We talked a lot about those. They happened. Let's move on. What happened after the reading wars? The National Reading Panel. We talked about that. We didn't really go into No Child Left Behind, however, and that was a result of the National Reading Panel, which was a result of the reading wars, which is a result of back and back and back. No Child Left Behind was this idea that we needed to have really scientifically rooted understandings of what made people succeed, and then set really rigorous standards and really rigorous goals and instructional strategies to get there. On the surface, that's all really good things, but the way that that was enacted was high stakes testing. And when I say high stakes, I mean high stakes for teachers, high stakes for students, high stakes for everyone involved. That was when it was in this era that we started saying that your students have to test in a certain way or you could lose your job. Your students have to test in a certain way or your school could be closed. I have never understood how closing a school helps students, but they had good intentions. They thought that they just needed to shake things up in a really big way to improve the situations that students had. Now, I have reservations about a single test or even 3 tests or 4 tests over a year determining the learning this student has done. But there have been other consequences to being so focused on large, summative assessments, and that is a narrowing of what students are taught because it tends to center on what's tested. That's often called teaching to the test. Whole subjects, because they're not tested, have virtually disappeared. Social studies is a great example in the elementary school. Very little social studies is taught because there's not a high stakes test associated with it. There's also an over-reliance on really expensive materials that are associated with these high stakes tests. And I think that knowledge from teachers, knowledge from community members, I feel like that's more valuable than these materials, especially since our educational understandings change, as you've seen. And these educational materials, they might seem to change with our different understandings, but realistically they don't. They get new names, sometimes they're new, and in a lot of cases, they're there again because people want to help students. But a lot of those materials are not prepared by the people who have been trained to help students or who have experience helping students, teachers. Now, there are some great materials out there that are teacher-directed, that are teacher-focused, that are developed by people who know a ton about learning. It's just about finding them sort of in the sea of materials. And a lot of that has been spurred on by these high-stakes tests. So after we have No Child Left Behind, we get Common Core. And high-stakes testing still plays a central role, maybe a little bit less, but now we're also getting those standards that we had back in the 70s. We're sort of getting a callback to that. There's this minimum standard that you should be able to get to. Again, it's a cycle, such a cycle. Okay, that's a lot. We've rehashed the background of assessment a little. What have we learned about assessment? Let's take a look. Good assessments. Good assessments are reliable, valid, and transparent. Reliability, fairly simple. A reliable test is one that yields the same results again and again given similar circumstances and similar students. Related to that idea is the idea that you can grade the assessment reliably, that you'll score the same test from the same student the same over time, that different teachers would score the same test the same way, or at least mostly the same way. That's called inter-rater reliability. So the ratings that you would give the assessment would remain the same between raters. The most reliable instrument in the world is reliant on being scored reliably. They're intertwined. You can't have a reliable instrument in an unreliable scoring system. They have to intertwine. And if reliability is your goal, you can understand where high-stakes testing comes from, because multiple choice tests are very reliable in this sense. They're going to be very similar in the grading portion. You're going to say, oh, it's A, it's A, it's C, it's C, and that's it. But that's where we start getting to the second criteria, which is validity. Basically, validity is accurately measuring what you say you want to measure. Here's an example of where validity of a test can be highly subjective, and then that lack of validity can call into question the reliability of the measure. So imagine that a student is sitting at a computer taking a math test. Let's call her Nevaeh. So Nevaeh is taking her third standardized math test of the year. Her scores have remained relatively stagnant. They don't seem to move. It's confusing because her math teacher says she does great. So why isn't that test score moving? And if you're wondering, hey, why are you talking about math? This is a literacy course. I'm getting there. So the test reliably is executed over and over again. It's a computer test. The circumstances are the same for all the students. It is easily scored because it's multiple choice, so the scoring reliability is really high. But now I'm going to tell you that Nevaeh is a first-generation student who has moved from Senegal, and her native language is French. So what does that mean? It means that when she's trying to read the problems that are being presented to her in her math test, that her reading is interfering with her math. Remember, validity, accurately measure what you say you're measuring. The test says it's measuring math ability, but it is also secretly measuring reading ability. And this is not just an anecdote. I changed the name, I changed the country, but I have been in a room with a student who was just silently crying because they were stuck. They wanted to do well. Math was a class they were excelling in when they weren't necessarily excelling in other areas, and they had gotten to a problem and they didn't know a word. And not knowing that word and not knowing whether that word was important had completely stopped them in their tracks. The word was bushel. The problem talked about bushels of apples. And the student didn't know if bushel was like dozen. Did it represent some kind of number that's like secretly hidden in the English language? She didn't know. So her ability to read English was a major factor in her ability to express math ability. And it's impossible, as far as I'm aware, to create perfect assessments that only measure the things you want to measure, every single student for every single day, just as effective year after year. Just keep validity in mind when you create your assessments. Make sure, as much as possible, that your nice, reliable instruments are also valid, that you're measuring what you want to measure as much as possible. The last bit, transparent. What do I mean by transparent? I mean that it is transparent instructionally, that you're going to have students doing similar activities that they have done during your instructional periods. So why is that important? It's important because transferring knowledge isn't as easy as people think it can be when they're adults. For students, it can be very difficult. And again, validity, right? We're trying to measure what we say we're measuring. If you throw new ways to use the knowledge at students, not just slightly new, but completely different, then their ability to take that assessment and have it really study what they learned from you, it's kind of ruined. So ideally, you have them doing things like, if they're doing reading passages in the test, you'll have had them doing reading passages. If you're having them answer long format questions, well, they've done that before. They've had chances to practice long format questions. I have had experiences as a student never writing an essay in a course. I get to the final exam, I have essay questions, but I've never written an essay for this teacher. I have no idea what writing an essay in this class means, what the teacher would want, what the expectations would be. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about transparency here. This does not mean teach to the test, because I hate that. Don't do that. You don't tailor your instruction to match the test. You tailor the test to match your instruction as much as possible. High stakes testing can prevent this in some ways. Obviously, give your students opportunities to be successful on those tests. They involve reading passages, have students read passages. Anyways, moving on. Let's start looking at some different kinds of assessment. Okay, so spelling inventories, for example. This is pretty common, especially in elementary level classes, but you'll find it even in upper level English language arts classes. It's simple. A teacher reads a list of words. The student spells those words. Then after that, the teacher evaluates the spelling of those words. Here's the part that makes it really important. You look for patterns in the spelling mistakes. The patterns are crucial because you don't want to necessarily just say, oh, they missed this word, they must not understand how to write this word. You want to figure out what kinds of words that they're struggling with. This is one example. This is Words Their Way upper level spelling inventory. You'll notice that it's organized. It has the words are written on one side, and then the word is broken up. So switch, for example, is sw-i-ch. See the phonics? And so it's saying, okay, did they hear this blend? Sw. Did they see the vowel? Did they hear that vowel? I? Because this is all oral. And then did they get the ch? It's a complex sound that we make. We make it frequently in our words. Did they hear it and were they able to write it down? And they do that for every single word. You'll notice the complexity of the words increases. What you're looking for in their spelling increases. Once you have this down, you're going to notice, oh, if they missed it on one word, they didn't hear it in that word, fine. But if they miss the complex consonants on all of the words, or 4 or 5 of the words, maybe they're struggling with that. If you have a whole class of people, or at least a large portion of your class, struggling to write those types of sounds, well, then you have some really great ideas of what to do with your word study. That assessment feeds back into your instruction. So that's one way. Running records, again, just an example. These are certainly used more often in primary situations, but they're so predominant in helping students become fluent readers that I wanted to mention them. Again, procedure, fairly simple. Teacher asks a student to read a pre-selected piece of text. Student reads that text out loud. The teacher listens, they take notes, and then look for patterns. We're looking for patterns a lot. Assessment is all about looking for patterns in a lot of ways. It's not, we all make mistakes, right? Everyone makes a mistake every now and then. So the idea isn't to just try and like jump on people's one little mistake. The idea is to look for patterns of mistakes because patterns of mistakes usually reveal patterns of misunderstanding, and misunderstandings we can address in our instruction. So let's take a quick look at a running record. As with all assessment, your goal should be to record the things that you want to understand about your students, right? Validity. You want to make sure you're measuring what you want to know about. This is one example. It is a way of keeping track. So typically the student has a copy of the text, you as the teacher have a copy of the text. As they read, you are literally marking every single word. If they got it right, quick tick mark or check mark, depending on, but it's supposed to be fast. You just follow along with them. Are they omitting a word? Cool, put a dash. Are they attempting a word to sound it out? Because that's different from just fluently having it. So you mark it. You mark that they had to attempt it. Did they repeat a word? Probably a sign of understanding what's going on, right? That's actually a sign a lot of times of monitoring comprehension, but you note it. You note it down there. Did they have to ask you for help? Right? All of these things, you're noting it down as they read. It shouldn't be long, maybe a page or two. But you can get a lot of information about them in just a quick minute or two of their reading and you being really purposeful in what you record. That's a running record. Okay, my older grades, I'm not trying to leave you out. Let's look at an essay. And we're going to look at an essay and how we can grade it using a rubric. So this is different. Running records and spelling inventories, in a lot of ways, they're looking at decoding. We're looking at that code breaking step, and we're trying to say, okay, are you code breaking appropriately? Are you recoding appropriately? Now we're going to look at something that's a little more meaning making, a little bit more analytical, and kind of gets into those higher order thinking spaces for students. And that can be represented in a lot of ways. Presentations, it could be with research projects. Let's say that this research report has been written. When judging content in an assignment, my preference would be to communicate expectations really clearly with students prior to the assignment's completion. You'll note that the majority of your assignments have rubrics. The rubrics are there for me to grade with for sure, but they're also there for you to see ahead of time. They're there for you to see, here is what is expected in this assignment. This is what is considered high achievement. Now I know what I'm trying to do at a little bit higher of a level. So here's an example. You'll notice the way that rubrics work. There are points on the top. You'll see that I always forget that I can highlight in this. Here we go. You'll see these points at the top. That's not the highlighter, but that is. You'll see these points at the top. 4, 3, 2, 1. So what you do in a rubric is you read through the paper and you say, okay, here's the topic. And I know we're trying to see if they can maintain their focus, right? This is a 6th grader. It's the entire paper about what they said it would be about. And if it mostly is, but here or there they've thrown in some really random things, I might select 3. That means that for this aspect, they've earned 3 points. Their organization, they might have gotten sidetracked, but their organization is on point. It's logical, it makes sense. I even understand why they got off track and then returned to it. Elaboration. They did okay. They didn't do great. We'll say that they had at least 2 specific details for their paragraph, so we'll say that they get those 3 points. The vocabulary was fine. Again, 3 points. Unfortunately, that grammatical control, however, misspellings everywhere, no punctuation. I did once from a 4th grade student receive a paper that had no spaces. I think they were trying to be funny, but either way, it was brutal and definitely did not use conventions correctly of writing. So I marked that down and they get no points for that. Now I add up all these points so I can see that I have 3, I have 4, 3, and 3. I know that the total possible would have been 4, 4, 4, 4, and 3. So that is 16 plus 3, so 19, or sorry, plus 2. So 18 is the total possible points for this report. And they have 9 plus 4 is 13, 0, so they have 13 points. Missing out on these points was crucial for them. That's it. That's as simple as it is, and it's really reliable because grading content is super subjective. This is a reliable way to at least be using the same expectations for every single paper, reminding you of what they are and communicating them in the same way to students. All right. So many things can be said about assessment. All right, you're ready to move on. So the things you should do next, as I'm sure you're very used to already, read the required readings. This week we have 3 required readings. Don't be intimidated, however, because all 3 of those still only total 21 pages. It's a big topic, but so I wanted to give you a lot of little slices. That has also affected our optional readings this week. They're amazing, they're great. They are a little less specifically focused, so specifically focused on secondary or content areas or that sort of thing, but they have amazing activities and suggestions for assessment forms and tools that could be adapted to a lot of different contexts. So if you have an opportunity, check those out. When you're done with the readings, time to do the activity. This week, you are going to be assessing. So I'm going to provide some student work. I'm going to provide a way to assess that work, and you're going to get some practice doing that. After you have assessed, take the quiz. After the quiz, on to Module 5, and I will see you there. Have a great week, everybody.